The morning sun barely touched the tops of the factory buildings when John Mitchell parked his car 3 blocks away. Not his usual sleek company car, but an old, beaten-up Honda he'd borrowed from his groundskeeper. He caught his reflection in the rearview mirror and hardly recognized himself. Gone was the perfectly trimmed beard and designer clothes that had become his signature look over 20 years of building his manufacturing empire. Instead, a scruffy mustache sat above his lip and his salt and pepper hair was hidden beneath a worn baseball cap. John took a deep breath and grabbed his lunchbox, a simple brown paper bag containing a sandwich his wife had insisted on making herself when he told her about his plan. "You're crazy," she had said, but the pride in her eyes told a different story. "Just be careful and remember why you're doing this." Why was he doing this? At 58, with more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, he could have easily sent in a team of consultants to figure out why his newest factory acquisition was hemorrhaging workers and struggling with productivity. But John had built his first factory with his own 2 hands 30 years ago, working alongside every employee. He knew that sometimes the only way to understand a problem was to see it from the ground up. The rumors about this particular factory had been troubling. Anonymous complaints about unfair treatment, especially toward older workers. As someone approaching retirement age himself, these allegations hit close to home. John adjusted his worn work boots and began the walk to the factory, practicing his slouch, trying to shed decades of confident posture that came from running board meetings. Today he wasn't John Mitchell, owner of Mitchell Manufacturing. Today he was Jack Morris, a man down on his luck looking for honest work. The factory loomed ahead, its gray exterior blending with the overcast sky. A few workers hurried through the main entrance, shoulders hunched, faces grim. Not exactly the picture of workplace satisfaction John hoped for in his companies. The security guard barely glanced at him as he approached the side entrance marked Employment Office. Inside, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes directed him to fill out an application. "Not much to it," John said, keeping his voice rougher than usual as he handed back the completed form. "Been sweeping floors most of my life. Lost my last job when the place closed down." The woman, her nameplate read Diane, scanned his paperwork with practiced efficiency. "We're short on janitorial staff. Been having trouble keeping people." She didn't elaborate, but her tight expression spoke volumes. "When can you start?" "Right now," John replied. 30 minutes later, after a cursory tour from a harried HR assistant, John found himself clutching a push broom in the main production area. The noise was deafening, machines whirring, metal clanging against metal, occasional shouts rising above the industrial symphony. He began sweeping, keeping his head down while his eyes took in everything. The factory floor was divided into sections, each dedicated to a different part of the manufacturing process. Workers moved with practiced precision, but there was a tension in the air that John recognized immediately. This wasn't the positive pressure of a well-run operation. This was fear. "Hey, new guy." The voice boomed even over the machine noise. John turned to see a stocky man with a clipboard striding toward him. The man's navy blue shirt had Foreman stitched above the pocket, and his face was set in permanent lines of disapproval. "You missed a spot there. And there. What are we paying you for?" John nodded deferentially. "Sorry, sir, still learning the layout." The foreman, whose name badge read Robert Bride, snorted. "Well, learn faster, this isn't a retirement home." He stalked away, heading toward an older woman struggling to keep up with her section of the assembly line. "Chen, pick up the pace. Those young folks over there are doing twice your numbers." John watched as the woman, Chen, flinched slightly before increasing her already frantic movements. Her hands, marked with the slight tremor of age, flew over the components. Nearby, a group of younger workers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but kept their heads down. During his lunch break, John sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, observing. The workers seemed to segregate themselves by age. Younger employees clustered together, speaking in hushed tones, while the older workers sat in smaller groups or alone, eating quickly as if eager to get back to work. A tray clattered down, across from him. "Mind if I join? All the other spots are taken." It was Chen, the woman from the assembly line. "Please," John gestured to the seat. "You're new," she stated, not a question. "I'm Chen. Been here 22 years since before Mitchell bought the place." John nearly choked on his sandwich. "That long? You must know this place inside out." Chen's eyes, bright despite the fatigue evident on her face, darted around before she leaned forward. "Used to be a good place to work. Decent folks running it, but then old management retired and we got Robert as our foreman. Been hell for those of us over 50. She tapped her temple. "We know too much, ask too many questions. Robert prefers workers who just nod and follow orders, even when those orders make no sense for production." John felt a surge of anger, but kept his face neutral. "Sounds tough." Last month, Lee retired early. His shoulders couldn't take the heavy lifting anymore. Should have been reassigned to quality control. Man has eyes like a hawk, caught defects nobody else could see. Instead, Robert kept him hauling crates until he couldn't lift his arms anymore. Chen sighed. Week before that, Amir quit after 30 years, and before him, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Chen stood quickly, her food barely touched. Back to the grind. Word of advice: stay invisible around Robert. He's got it out for anyone who isn't young and desperate for the job. As John returned to his sweeping, his mind was racing. Just half a day in, and he was already seeing patterns that no consultant's report could capture. The foreman's voice echoed across the floor again, this time berating an older man for taking too long with a machine calibration. John gripped his broom tighter. 1 week, he promised himself. 1 week of watching, listening, and gathering evidence. Then Robert the foreman would learn exactly who had been sweeping his floors, and things at this factory would never be the same again. 3 days into his undercover work, John's muscles ached in ways they hadn't in decades. Pushing a broom for 8 hours straight was more physically demanding than any executive workout he'd done at his private gym. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the knot of anger growing in his chest as he watched Robert's daily mistreatment of the older workers. The morning began like the others. John arrived early, changed into his janitor uniform in the cramped locker room, and started his rounds before most workers clocked in. This gave him precious time to observe the factory without the watchful eye of the foreman. "Morning, Jack," called Chen as she entered, a full 30 minutes before her shift. John had noticed many older employees came in early, not from enthusiasm, but from fear. They needed the extra time to prepare their stations to keep up with Robert's impossible demands. "Morning," John replied, leaning on his broom. "You're here early again." Chen nodded, her tired eyes crinkling at the corners. "Have to be. Robert times my assembly quota now. Says I'm too slow." She lowered her voice. "Did you see what happened to Tom yesterday?" John had seen it. Tom, a gray-haired man in his early 60s who worked in quality control, had been publicly humiliated when Robert transferred him to the loading dock. Said his eyes weren't sharp enough anymore. Chen continued, shaking her head. "Tom's caught more defects than anyone, but now he's lifting crates all day. His back won't last a week." The factory doors burst open, and Robert strode in, clipboard in hand. Chen immediately hurried to her station. John bent over his broom, watching from beneath the brim of his cap as Robert made a beeline for the older workers, checking their stations with exaggerated scrutiny. "Wang!" Robert barked at an older man adjusting a machine. "This calibration was supposed to be done yesterday." "I tried to explain, sir," Wang replied calmly, though his hands trembled slightly. "The specifications you gave wouldn't work with." "Excuses," Robert cut him off. "I don't need 30 years of your so-called experience to tell me how to run my floor. Just follow the instructions." John gripped his broom tighter, forcing himself to stay silent. As owner, he knew that Wang was right. The specifications Robert had demanded would cause quality issues down the line. But Robert wasn't interested in being correct. He was interested in being obeyed. Later that morning, John was sweeping near the break room when he overheard Robert talking to his assistant foreman, a younger man named Pat, who mimicked Robert's management style. "HR's breathing down my neck about age diversity. Robert sneered, making air quotes. Like I need these dinosaurs slowing down my numbers. What are you going to do? Pat asked. Make life difficult enough that they quit on their own, Robert replied casually as if discussing the weather. No severance that way. Been working great so far. John ducked around the corner before they spotted him, his heart pounding. This wasn't just bad management, it was deliberate discrimination. He needed more evidence. During lunch, John sat with a group of workers for the first time, rather than observing from afar. Chen had invited him to join her table, where Tom sat, nursing a sore back along with Layla, a woman in her mid-50s who worked in inventory. How long has Robert been foreman? John asked between bites of his sandwich. 2 years, Layla said. Came in when Mitchell Manufacturing bought the place. Not that we've ever seen this Mitchell person. She didn't notice John's slight flinch. Previous owner used to visit weekly, knew everyone by name. Robert's been pushing out the older folks since day one, Tom added, rubbing his lower back. Started subtly, changing stations, increasing quotas just for us, writing up minor mistakes. Now he's not even hiding it. Have you reported him? John asked. The table fell silent. Finally, Chen spoke. Liu tried. Filed a formal complaint 6 months ago. Was fired 2 weeks later for performance issues that never existed before. The young ones see it, Layla whispered. But they're scared for their jobs too. Economy's tight. John nodded, fighting to keep his expression neutral when he wanted to storm into his real office and fire Robert on the spot. But that would solve only one problem. He needed to understand how deep this rot went. After lunch, John swept his way to the administrative offices, timing it so he'd be cleaning when most staff were in a department meeting. He overheard the HR manager, a nervous woman named Vicky, on the phone. I know the turnover numbers look bad, she was saying, presumably to someone at company headquarters, people who worked for John but had clearly never alerted him to these issues. But Robert insists it's just retirement age. No, I haven't looked into the pattern myself. Yes, I understand headquarters is concerned. That evening, as the factory workers filed out, John noticed Robert stop a young worker named Raj. Unlike his treatment of the older employees, Robert was all smiles and backslaps with Raj. Good man, Robert said loudly. Nearly double your station's quota today. That's what I like to see, young blood, fresh ideas, none of that, but we've always done it this way nonsense. Raj looked uncomfortable with the praise, especially when his eyes met Tom's as the older man limped past them toward the exit. As John finished his final sweep, he noticed Chen struggling to put away some heavy equipment that had been mysteriously moved to a high shelf, clearly another of Robert's tactics. Without a word, John helped her reach it. Thanks, she said quietly. You know, you're different from the other new hires. How so? John asked, suddenly worried his cover was thin. You notice things. You care. Chen smiled sadly. Be careful with that. Caring too much gets you targeted around here. John walked to his borrowed car that evening with renewed purpose. 1 week of observation had become insufficient. He needed to understand exactly how Robert had created this toxic culture, who at headquarters had been ignoring it, and most importantly, how the older workers' knowledge and experience could actually improve the factory if they were treated with respect. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of week 2 undercover, and John Mitchell, playing janitor Jack Morris, had only just begun to clean up this mess. 10 days into his undercover mission, John had developed a routine. He arrived early, nodded to the older workers who also came in before their shifts, and kept his broom moving while his eyes and ears collected everything happening around him. He'd taken to carrying his phone in his pocket, the voice recorder app running whenever Robert was nearby. This morning, John was sweeping near the assembly line when he noticed Wang struggling with a heavy equipment part. Robert stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the older man strain. Need a hand? John asked Wang. Before Wang could answer, Robert stepped between them. He doesn't need help. He needs to work faster or find another job. Robert glared at John. And you need to mind your own business, sweeper. As Robert walked away, John helped Wang anyway. Thanks, Wang whispered. My shoulder's been giving me trouble since he moved me from my regular station. How long were you at your old position? John asked. 15 years, Wang replied. I trained most of the technicians here. But suddenly Robert decided I wasn't flexible enough for the new production methods. He shook his head. The methods that have already caused 3 machinery breakdowns this month. Later that afternoon, John was cleaning the hallway outside the management offices when he heard Robert's voice through the partially open door. I'm telling you, Pat, these performance reviews are our ticket, Robert was saying to his assistant. If we rate all the older workers low enough, we can justify letting them go. Just need to document performance issues for a few weeks. John slipped his phone from his pocket, making sure the recorder was running. But some of them have perfect records for years, Pat replied, sounding uncertain for once. Chen hasn't missed a day in 5 years. Then we create issues, Robert said impatiently. Move their equipment when they're not looking. Change their quotas without notice. Write them up when they can't keep up. It's not hard. John's grip tightened on his broom handle. He had suspected this level of deliberate sabotage, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. I don't know, boss, Pat said. Vicky in HR is asking questions now. Headquarters called her about the turnover rates. Robert laughed. Vicky's spineless. I've got her convinced it's all just coincidence. Besides, by the time anyone from corporate gets around to investigating, we'll have a younger, faster workforce and better numbers to show for it. John had heard enough. He quietly moved away, the damning conversation safely recorded. At lunch, John joined Chen and the others again. He had become part of their small group now, trusted as someone who didn't report back to Robert. You all know a lot about this factory, John said casually. Probably more than anyone else here. Tom nodded. Combined, this table has over 100 years of experience in manufacturing. Not that it matters anymore. It matters, John insisted. What would you change about the production line if you could? The table fell silent, surprised by the question. Finally, Layla spoke up. For starters, the new layout Robert implemented wastes time. Workers have to walk twice as far between stations now, and the quality checks come too late in the process, Chen added, warming to the subject. We find defects after we've already used expensive materials. If we checked earlier, we could save thousands. Soon the whole table was talking, offering insights that made perfect sense to John's experienced eye. These weren't outdated ideas from workers resistant to change. These were valuable observations from people who understood the factory inside and out. Why hasn't anyone listened to these ideas? John asked. Wang sighed. We tried. Robert shut down the suggestion program the first month he took over. Said it was slowing down progress. After lunch, John made his way to Tom, who had been reassigned, to the loading dock despite his bad back. Finding a moment when they were alone, John asked, How exactly did Robert justify moving you from quality control? Tom looked around nervously before answering. Said my documentation wasn't up to standard. But look at this. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. I've tracked every defect I've found for 20 years. Last month alone, I caught faulty parts that would have cost the company over $50,000 in returns or repairs. May I? John asked, reaching for the notebook. He quickly took photos of several pages with his phone. This might be important someday. Don't get yourself in trouble. On my account, Tom warned. Robert doesn't like people asking questions. The next day, John arrived to find Chen upset. Her workstation had been completely rearranged overnight. All my tools were moved, she explained, fighting back tears of frustration. And Robert increased my quota by 15%, said it was a company-wide adjustment. But none of the younger workers got the same increase. John helped her reorganize her station before Robert arrived. As they worked, he noticed something. These assembly instructions, he said, pointing to the paper taped to her desk. They're different from the ones I saw yesterday. Chen looked closer. You're right, these steps would make the product unstable. She quickly found her old instructions and compared them. Someone changed them. If I had followed these, every unit would have failed inspection. John took photos of both sets of instructions. Keep the old ones, he advised, and document any other changes like this. By the end of the second week, John had gathered substantial evidence, recordings of Robert admitting to targeting older workers, photos of doctored instructions, testimony from longtime employees, and documentation of the systematic harassment. He also had something equally valuable: detailed suggestions from the older workers about how to improve factory operations, ideas that could actually increase productivity while creating a better work environment. On Friday evening, as the factory emptied, Robert cornered John near the supply closet. "I've been watching you, Morris," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Asking a lot of questions. Spending time with the old-timers. Taking pictures around my factory." John straightened up, momentarily forgetting his cover. "Just trying to understand how things work," he said carefully. Robert stepped closer. "Well, understand this. Monday morning, you're reassigned to night shift. Alone. And if I catch you with your phone out again, you're fired. This is my factory and I don't need some janitor stirring up trouble." John nodded submissively, but inside he was smiling. Robert had just made two critical mistakes: claiming ownership of a factory he merely managed, and threatening the very man who actually owned it. "See you Monday," John said quietly. As he walked to his car, John made a decision. He had seen enough. The charade would end on Monday, but not with him on night shift. It was time for John Mitchell to return to his factory, and Robert was about to learn just who had been sweeping his floors. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle, matching John's mood perfectly. After a weekend of preparation, he was ready to end his undercover mission. He had spent Sunday evening trimming his fake mustache, ironing his best suit, and reviewing all the evidence he had collected. Today, he arrived at the factory earlier than usual. The night security guard barely glanced at him as he walked in with his janitor's uniform folded over his arm rather than wearing it. Instead, John wore slacks and a button-up shirt, not his usual designer suit, but still a step up from his cleaning clothes. He headed straight for the locker room, where he changed into his work clothes one last time. In his pocket, he kept his owner's ID badge and his phone loaded with evidence. He wanted to start the day as Jack the janitor and end it as John the owner. The first workers began trickling in, including Chen, Tom, Wang, and Layla. They nodded to him as usual, unaware that this would be the last day of Robert's reign of terror. John had already contacted his most trusted executives from headquarters the night before. They would be arriving for the surprise inspection that was scheduled for the staff meeting at 10 a.m. At 9:30, Robert strutted onto the factory floor, clipboard in hand as always. He spotted John immediately. "Morris!" he bellowed. "What are you doing here?" "I told you night shift," John continued, sweeping calmly. "Just finishing up the morning cleaning, sir. I'll be gone before your important meeting." Robert narrowed his eyes. "You got 10 minutes. Then I don't want to see your face until 11 p.m. tonight." As Robert walked away to berate another older worker, John caught Chen's eye and gave her a small wink. She looked confused, but offered a tentative smile in return. At precisely 10 a.m., the factory bell rang, signaling the start of the monthly staff meeting. Workers began making their way to the large break room that doubled as a meeting space. John slipped into the bathroom, quickly changed back into his regular clothes, slicked back his hair, and removed his fake mustache. He pulled out his owner's ID badge and draped it around his neck. Looking in the mirror, he was once again John Mitchell, owner of Mitchell Manufacturing. But now he was a changed man, one who had seen firsthand how people could be mistreated when nobody was watching. John waited until Robert had begun the meeting before entering. Through the break room windows, he could see Robert standing at the front of the room, gesturing emphatically about new quotas and productivity metrics. Behind Robert, a presentation slide showed graphs with manipulated statistics that made the older workers look less productive than they actually were. John took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The room fell silent instantly. Robert turned, annoyance flashing across his face at the interruption. "Excuse me, this is a closed meeting for factory person." Robert's words died in his throat as he recognized the ID badge. His face paled. "Mr. Mitchell, we weren't expecting you today." Clearly, John replied calmly, walking to the front of the room. He could hear the whispers spreading as workers recognized the janitor they'd been talking to for the past 2 weeks. Chen's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "I'm sorry for the surprise visit," John addressed the room, "but sometimes the only way to understand what's really happening in a factory is to work alongside the people who keep it running." Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Sir, I can explain." "Actually, Robert," John cut him off, "I think I'll do the explaining today." He turned to address the room. "For the past 2 weeks, I've been working here as a janitor named Jack Morris. I've seen how this factory operates when the owner isn't watching. I've spoken with many of you, listened to your concerns, and witnessed firsthand how some of our most experienced employees have been treated." The door opened again, and 3 executives from headquarters walked in, including the company's HR, director, and legal counsel. "This is highly irregular, sir." Robert tried again, sweat now visible on his forehead. "If you had concerns, you could have simply called me." John pulled out his phone. "Would you have told me that you've been deliberately targeting older workers for harassment? Would you have mentioned changing work instructions to set them up for failure? Would you have admitted to moving equipment to make their jobs physically harder?" "That's absurd," Robert sputtered. "Is it?" John pressed a button on his phone and Robert's voice filled the room. "These performance reviews are our ticket. If we rate all the older workers low enough, we can justify letting them go. Just need to document performance issues for a few weeks." Robert's face turned from white to red. "You were spying on me. That's illegal." "Actually," said the woman who had entered with the other executives, stepping forward, "as the company's legal counsel, I can assure you that an owner monitoring his own business is perfectly legal. Discrimination based on age, however, is not." By now, the workers were watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction. Tom and Chen exchanged glances of disbelief. "I trusted you to run this factory with integrity," John said to Robert, his voice firm but controlled. "Instead, you created a hostile work environment, drove away our most experienced employees, and damaged our productivity and quality in the process." Robert looked around desperately. "The numbers don't lie. The older workers are slower. I was just trying to improve efficiency." John turned to the workers. "Wang, would you mind explaining your idea about the production line layout?" Wang stood, nervously. "The current layout adds unnecessary steps. If we rearranged 3 stations, we could reduce walking time by 40% and improve flow." "And Chen," John continued, "what about your suggestion for quality control?" Chen cleared her throat. "Moving quality checks earlier in the process would catch defects before we waste materials. It could save thousands each month." John turned, back to Robert. "These are the people you called dinosaurs, the ones whose experience you dismissed, the ones who could have improved this factory if you'd bothered to listen." The HR director stepped forward. "Robert, please collect your personal belongings. Security will escort you out." As Robert was led away, protesting loudly about unfair treatment, the irony of which was lost on no one, John addressed the remaining workers. "I owe all of you an apology. I should have paid closer attention to what was happening here. Starting today, things will change." He looked at each of the older workers he'd befriended. "We'll be implementing a new management structure that values experience and respects every worker regardless of age. And we'll be reviewing every termination and forced retirement from the past 2 years, with appropriate compensation for those who were pushed out unfairly." The room broke into applause. As it quieted, John caught Chen's eye. "And one more thing," he added. "From now on, every factory in our company will have a direct line to my office. Because sometimes the most important voices are the ones on the factory floor." As the meeting adjourned, workers approached John, some still in shock, others eager, to share their ideas. Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day the owner himself would sweep our floors," he said with a grin. "Best education I ever got," John replied honestly. "And the most important cleaning I've ever done." 6 months had passed since the day John Mitchell revealed his true identity on the factory floor. The winter chill had given way to spring warmth, and similar changes had swept through the factory itself. John stood at the entrance, watching workers arrive for the morning shift. Unlike before, there were smiles and casual conversations as people walked in. The heavy cloud of fear that had hung over the place was gone, replaced by something he hadn't expected to create. A sense of community. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," called Chen as she walked past. No longer arriving 30 minutes early out of fear, she now came at a reasonable time, looking rested and confident. "Good morning, Chen. How's the new quality check system working out?" Chen beamed with pride. "Defect rates down another 2% last week. We're saving about $5,000 a week in materials now." John nodded appreciatively. The system had been Chen's idea, one of dozens of improvements suggested by experienced workers that had been implemented over the past months. Inside, the factory looked different. Workstations had been rearranged based on Wang's layout suggestions, reducing unnecessary movement and making the workflow more efficient. Ergonomic equipment had been installed to reduce physical strain, and flexible scheduling options meant workers could choose shifts that suited their needs. But the biggest change wasn't physical. It was in how the place was run. John made his way to what used to be Robert's office, now occupied by the new production manager, Tom. After the confrontation, John had recognized Tom's leadership qualities and deep knowledge of the factory operations. Despite his initial protests about being just a quality guy, Tom had proven to be an exceptional manager who led by example and valued everyone's input. "Big day today," Tom said as John entered the office. "First quarterly review since the changes, numbers just came in." "Let's hear it," John said, taking a seat. Tom spread the reports across his desk. Productivity up 22% compared to last quarter under Robert. Quality complaints down 35%. Worker turnover dropped from 27% annually to just 3% in the past 6 months. "And the cost of all the changes we made?" John asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it again. Tom grinned. "Paid for themselves twice over already. Turns out treating people well is good business." Later that morning, John joined the monthly all-staff meeting, now held in a circle rather than with management talking down to workers from the front. Tom led the session, recognizing achievements and addressing challenges openly. "Next item," Tom announced, "is our mentorship program. Layla, would you give us an update?" Layla stood, no longer the nervous woman John had met 6 months ago. "We've paired 15 new hires with experienced team members. The training time has been cut in half because the newcomers learn directly from people who really know the machines." A young worker named Raj raised his hand. "I just want to say that working with Wang has taught me more in 3 weeks than I learned in my entire technical school program. These folks know stuff you can't learn from manuals." Wang, sitting nearby, tried to hide his smile but couldn't quite manage it. After the meeting, John walked the factory floor, stopping to chat with workers. He'd made it a point to visit weekly, no longer as a secret janitor, but as an owner who understood what happened on the ground. Near the assembly line, he paused to watch a group of workers, a mix of young and old, troubleshooting a minor issue together. There was no blame, no fear, just collaborative problem-solving. "Quite a change, isn't it?" said a voice beside him. It was Vicky from HR, who had been retrained and given a second chance after admitting she'd been too afraid of Robert to stand up for the older workers. "Night and day," John agreed. "The older workers we managed to bring back after they were forced out. They're doing wonderfully," Vicky continued. "And you know what surprised me most? The younger workers love having them here. They say they're learning things they never would have figured out on their own." John nodded. Experience can't be replaced, and neither can enthusiasm. We need both. That afternoon, John met with his executive team, who had flown in from headquarters for the quarterly review. They sat in the factory break room rather than a conference room, John's way of keeping them connected to the real work. "The Mitchell model," said his operations director, shaking her head in amazement as she reviewed the numbers. "Who would have thought that 2 weeks of undercover work would change the company's entire approach to management?" It's not rocket science, John replied. Listen to the people who do the work. Value experience. Create a workplace where people want to stay. The rest follows naturally. We've implemented similar changes at 3 other factories now, said another executive, all showing comparable improvements. The initial resistance from middle management faded once they saw the results. As the executives continued their discussion, John glanced out the window to the factory floor. Wang was showing a younger worker how to calibrate a machine with expert precision. Chen was leading her quality team with quiet confidence. Tom was walking the floor, listening more than talking. The factory had become what it should have been all along. Not just a place to produce goods, but a place where human knowledge and skill were valued above all else. Before leaving that day, John stopped by the janitor's closet where he had stored his broom during his undercover days. The new janitor, a friendly man named Paul who was treated with the same respect as everyone else, was surprised to see the owner there. "Something I can help you with, Mr. Mitchell?" Paul asked. "Just remembering," John said, touching the worn wooden handle of a push broom. "Sometimes the most important view of a company comes from the people who see everything but are rarely seen themselves." Paul nodded thoughtfully. "Well, for what it's worth, things are good here now. People even clean up after themselves most days," he added with a chuckle. On his drive back to headquarters, John reflected on how a simple decision to go undercover had changed not just one factory but his entire company. The Mitchell model was being implemented across all his facilities now, with regular feedback channels between workers and management, mentorship programs pairing experienced employees. With new hires and a strict zero-tolerance policy for age discrimination, John had even created a new company tradition. Once a year, every executive spent a week working an entry-level position in one of the factories. Some grumbled, but most returned with notebooks full of insights they'd never have gained from behind a desk. As for the aging workforce that Robert had tried so hard to push out, they had become the company's greatest asset. Their knowledge was now systematically captured and shared, their experience valued as the treasure it was. The quarterly financial reports showed what John already knew in his heart. Treating people with respect wasn't just the right thing to do, it was also good business. Productivity was up, costs were down, and for the first time in years, Mitchell Manufacturing had a waiting list of people hoping to work there. Sometimes, John thought as he drove past the factory gates, the most important cleaning isn't done with a broom. It's done by sweeping away the barriers that prevent good people from doing their best work, regardless of their age or position. And that was a lesson worth every blister his hands had earned during those 2 weeks pushing a broom.